Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's Ukrainian talk show on Pod TV. My name is Sasha Star, and today's guests are Dr. Jonathan Lockwood. Welcome to the show, Jonathan.
Well, thank you, Sasha. Glad to be here.
Great to have you, Jonathan. And Ivan Kucherenko from Kyiv, Ukraine. Welcome to the show, Ivan. I'm not sure if he is.
Well,
maybe he's stuck in Kyiv. Probably.
He's having trouble with the transporter beam. You know, this may be Star Trek. He's having trouble transporting into the studio.
Okay. Well, anyway, we are open for him or maybe somebody else to join us. Well, in the meantime, obviously, situation in Israel and Iran overshadows the Ukrainian situation by much.
Yeah, it does, and it still nevertheless has an indirect impact.
Yes,
which we can just it certainly has an indirect. It's not taking place in isolation. What it has done, at least for the moment, I would argue, is that it has basically pushed Ukraine not quite to a sideshow. We can't really consider the Russia-Ukraine war a sideshow simply because of its length, its duration, and its severity. And so we certainly can't, but from the United States perspective, right now, because the United States, now the Trump administration has several interlocking problems that it must consider. And most specifically, a problem which several commentators have said may well define President Trump's legacy for decades to come in how he deals with Iran and its potential to try to become a nuclear power. President Trump has stated on more than one occasion that Iran must never have a nuclear weapon, simply because Iran with a nuclear weapon, given the radical nature of its religious leadership, would constitute an existential threat to Israel and could wreak havoc among the nations of the world if it were allowed to develop both ballistic missiles and a nuclear warhead in addition to that. So it would become a very dangerous rogue actor. So given that, now President Trump's calculation, again, using just my perspective, because I am not an insider, I must emphasize that. I do not have access to inside sources that would give me specific, but I do have a great deal of experience in military history and in studying international relations and their dynamics. And in this case, President Trump's shall we say, his mindset is economically based rather than traditionally geopolitically based. He is interested, it would appear, in constructing an economic network based upon peace through strength, at least from his perspective. And so given that, he has to calculate when he's confronted with Iran developing a nuclear weapon, which could disrupt all of his plans for developing an economic network. What he has to calculate is how much confidence does he have in Israel's ability to destroy Iran's nuclear capability by themselves, without additional assistance or intervention by the United States. If President Trump calculates within the next 2 weeks or so, because July 4th is now the stated deadline for whether he'll decide, then he has to figure if he concludes that Israel can handle this by themselves, that he has very high confidence that they will be able to permanently destroy Iran's nuclear capability, then he will not feel compelled to drop a bunker buster and try to U.S. air power to intervene actively. If he has a significant element of doubt in his thinking that Israel might not be able to finish the job adequately, then, of course, then he will decide to use the bunker buster to help Israel finish the job and make sure that Iran does not ever become a nuclear power. So that is the calculus that I believe that President Trump is functioning under at this point. He is in crisis mode.
There is a little contradiction in what you just presented. I'll tell you why. So Trump believes that if Israel can finish the job itself, then there is no reason for US to use buster bombs. But without buster bombs, as we know, Israel cannot disable the Fordo facilities. So,
Not quite a contradiction. Israel, in order for Israel to finish the job themselves, they would have to have, and we don't know whether or not they have this capability, they would have to have personnel within Iran, a network within Iran capable of leading special forces operations, which could penetrate these facilities and disable or destroy the Fordo facility. We don't know whether or not Israel has that capability. That is the great X factor in this entire equation.
agree.
Israel
Yeah.
has that capability, then U.S. intervention becomes unnecessary. If they don't have it and they have to rely on the U.S. finishing the job with a bunker buster, well, obviously, then it becomes necessary. So the great X factor in this entire calculation is, does Israel have people on the inside capable of finishing off the nuclear facilities? That we don't know.
Okay. There is also a lot of doubts whether these very powerful bombs, each one weighing 30,000 pounds, if they can do the job, there are a lot of doubts on that.
It is. I don't believe it has ever been. I don't believe, to my best of my knowledge, it has ever been physically tested on a. They would have to war game it. They could use computer war game models, but as you know, computer war game models aren't necessarily 100% reliable. They are based upon algorithms and sort of what you program into it. So they could have very well done a computer war game modeling of the attack effectiveness of the bunker buster.
Okay,
And
they've used it once in Afghanistan, but it was just, I think, just almost almost like a war exercise.
yeah,
There was nothing there that they should
yeah,
have.
nothing. The Afghans were no threat to develop a nuclear weapon. They weren't. There was no deep-seated complex that it had to destroy. So yes, in that sense, we still have, but we still have an X factor in that sense. So this becomes the great uncertainty, and the Iranians themselves must in this great poker game says, does he really have the cards? Does he really have the capability? Can we afford to try and call his bluff? Do we think he's bluffing? And President Trump would be a very deadly person to play in a high-stakes poker game. But
as much as I read lately about this buster bombs, they are the most effective, and they're being dropped from the height of like 7-8 kilometers because they have at that point great kinetic energy,
right,
and
yeah.
they hit the target, penetrate it, and only then explode when all
right.
But that's not going to be enough to penetrate something like 250, 300 feet of this, basically a scale, absolutely reinforced by the
Iranians are counting on that.
Yeah,
they're counting on that to be effective.
So to be effective, these bombs have to drop one and then another one hitting exactly precisely where the first went in and do the same job. But even two bombs will not be enough on that considerable fortification. So you need probably 3-4 bombs, most likely.
Or consider this, Sasha. Consider the possibility of a combination effort between, let's say that, again, and have no confirmation of this possibility, but it does potentially exist. Let us say that the U.S. and Israel have behind the scenes, covertly, coordinated. This is okay, just in case, to make sure that this works, we're going to drop bunker buster bombs at the proper time, at a certain time and place, on this facility. Then your assets, if you have the special forces assets, you have to follow up on that devastation and go in and finish the job. And so it would have to be a cooperative, at that point, it would have to be bunker buster bombs plus intervention by Israeli special forces after the bunker buster bombs have hit in succession, created the chaos, and then the Israelis have to go in and finish the job. That is about the highest confidence type of operation that could exist, but it would also represent some risk for the United States as well, because it would be unequivocal intervention on the part of the United States against Iran and sending a message to the world: we will not permit a rogue nuclear state with potentially devastating political objectives to exist. And so that is definitely a high risk operation. But if you're looking at it from the standpoint of maximizing percentage of success, then the one that offers the best possibility is bunker buster use by the United States, followed up immediately, if not simultaneously, by Israeli special forces intervention.
I'm not sure about simultaneously, because
I misspoke. I'm trying to say you make sure as soon as the dust has settled, the Israeli special forces are coming in right behind it.
Well, I think that buster bombs are needed in order to actually finish this war as soon as possible. We don't want to go.
Oh no, you can't.
To come. But the end of the war, what represents now the end of the war for Israel and the United States, or both, or for the whole world? It is to make sure that Iran no longer has any capacity to produce nuclear weapon in foreseeable future. We're talking about at least 5, maybe 10, maybe even more years.
Right.
So in order to do that, there has to be confidence that there are not already produced large quantities of uranium, which is weapon ready, and so on. So it doesn't, not only that it cannot be produced, but that it doesn't exist. Because if you leave for the facilities, so you don't know whether there is enough enriched uranium or not.
You want to make sure there's no residual capability from which they could possibly reconstruct.
You know what you're talking about. So you need, before you sign a peace deal, you need to be 100% sure that it doesn't exist in that facilities or any other facilities. And for that, I don't believe how they can do it without you're talking about penetration, and so it's possible. You cannot deny
penetration with special forces. But actually, but to do what you're talking about now would require something which most serious military analysts would regard as highly problematic, and that is the actual military occupation of Iran.
No, you don't need it.
You don't need it, but
no, just the facilities, all these reactors, just make sure that there is, first of all, they cannot function, and second of all, there is no enriched uranium already produced, weapon grade qualities that you can use almost in the next few weeks to create the atomic bomb. That's all you need. You don't need to occupy Iran. Let them live in peace and joy, and you don't need to occupy them. Not at all.
And if you get the bonus, if you get what we would consider a bonus effect of the Iranian people, or basically rising up and overthrowing the Ayatollahs, so that you have a different regime in place that is not devoted to religious fanaticism or an absolutely visceral hate of the existence of the Jewish state, if they eschew that kind of political objective, and instead are willing to concentrate on developing the peace and prosperity of their own people, then you have the basis for lasting stability and actually for potential integration to what President Trump is obviously envisioning as an economic network in the Middle East, which would be much better for the long-term peace and prosperity of the entire region. That is a sounder strategy than just simply destroying Iran's nuclear capability and then leaving them at that. Yeah, there has to be some winning the peace afterwards. You have to minimize the possibility of such a regime ever emerging again.
Well, Jonathan, it's two-way street. If Iranian people are ready for cooperating with the West, and they will definitely have to topple Ayatollah or whatever regime is there. I think I have a feel that he is incapacitated one way or another. Maybe he is very sick. At least they're hiding him and so on. But it's irrelevant. To tell the truth, I'm not even sure that to eliminate him would be such a great deal for Israel or the United States.
Whenever I hear people talking about regime change as being beneficial, I keep thinking of this one novel, alternate history novel, that I mentioned on another program once. It's the title of the novel is Fox on the Rhine, and the premise of it was, what if Hitler had been assassinated, but his successor was even worse? Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the final solution. He was not crazy. He was totally rational, but totally evil. The architect of the final solution, and he said it could have made World War II would have the essential premise point of the book is that World War II would still have ended in an Allied victory, arguably, but the cost would have been immeasurably higher.
Yeah, I mentioned on the program another alternative history of World War II is that everything is the same army, same generals, everything's the same, except only two small things different. One, there was a situation in 1941 in Ukraine near, I think, what was the name? It's not Zhytomyr, it's Vinnytsia. I think that's where the German command in Ukraine was located. And one day Hitler was flying in a small plane to another location, and the plane had a crash, and Hitler survived, and the pilot was killed. So what if the opposite would happen and the Hitler would be killed and the pilot survived? And another one, which would be the only difference with reality, is that Germans would fortify and defend Malta, and British would not able to take it. These two things, they would change the war to a greatest degree, because then Guderian could continue his attack against Moscow without being distracted to some other places, whether it's St. Petersburg or Kiev.
And fortifying Malta or reducing Malta and preventing the British from holding it would have opened up the supply lines to North Africa. It would have solved Rommel's logistics problem. Rommel would have been able to take North Africa with the Africa Corps, and the way to the Middle East would have been open for Germany. So Germany and Italy would have dominated the Middle East, and they would have had access to Middle Eastern oil and a number of other things, essentially turning the Mediterranean into a German lake.
So actually they could go from south to Azerbaijan to get this Caspian Sea oil. They could go a completely different route, but
exactly, but those are the great what ifs, the great alternative possibilities. That is why, and by the way, what you are describing, academics and others refer to this as counterfactual history.
Yeah.
That's the technical term. Counterfactual history, the study of what ifs.
And if you remember, in 1941, Iran was taken over by British and Soviet Union forces, again, to not allow Hitler to get to the Iranian oil, but also to defend Azerbaijan if needed, because they're right on the border. So there are a lot of cases when history could take a different turn, but it did take this turn, not another one.
Well, as I have stated, the central premise of my book on the Lockwood Analytical Method for Prediction, I assert that the future is the sum total of interactions of free will. That every action by every person in human history has the potential to affect the future in either ways, either subtle or dynamic. And there is no such thing as an action that has no consequences. It does not exist. And for those who might doubt the significance of a single action, just consider, for example, if you are a certain political candidate and you're at a rally and you decide to turn your head at a critical moment, and a would-be assassin's bullet that splits just a split second before, and a would-be assassin's bullet that was intended to go through your head instead goes through your right ear. No matter what you think of President Trump personally or politically, there can be absolutely no doubt that his decision in that split second of space and time to turn his head, whether you consider it God prompting him to, hey, look at that, Mr. President, or something of whatever instinct caused him to do that, that single action has had a potentially a real decisive effect, not only on President Trump's personal history, but those of the United States and arguably the world in general. It's decisive. It's
what if you'll agree that was an act of God? And I have a very funny story about the
here's the somewhat frightening potential of that. If in fact it was an act of God, let's assume, because President Trump believes, and it's from my personal standpoint as a Christian, it's next to impossible for me to argue against the truth of what he believes, because if God deliberately decided to spare President Trump from assassination in order that President Trump could fulfill God's larger purpose for his life, and President Trump is in the process of figuring out just what that purpose is. Yeah, he's doing, okay, God, why did you let me live? What do you want me to do? Here I am trying to make America great again. Do you want me to make America great again?
The answer is Mr. Trump struggle, and
that's the struggle. He is struggling he is visibly struggling, and you can understand it. Okay. All right, God, you spared me from assassination. Now what do you want me to do? So this becomes the great problem and central struggle of what he is attempting to do.
But
it's very interesting.
If he will not get right the message, what is the right thing for him to do, and he will wrong way, then what was the purpose of God to save him?
God does not make mistakes. You have to assume that God is not, as Einstein once said, God does not play dice with the universe.
Jonathan, very interesting story about the act of God.
Yeah, okay.
I've heard it many years ago. So it's during the French Revolution. The Frenchmen caught Englishmen, Scotsmen, and Irishmen.
Okay.
So there was a trial, and all of them were convicted and to death by guillotine. So the first comes the Englishman. So the Frenchman ask, they put him on the prepared guillotine and ask, would you like to die as a brave man or as a coward? So Englishman ask, what's the difference? Well, if you die as a coward, then you will face down, and as a brave man, you will face up the guillotine. He says, okay, I'll die as a brave man. So they count 1, 2, 3. Blade comes down and stops right before his neck. So the Frenchman says, well, it's an act of God. You're free to go. The next comes Scotsman. Exactly the same thing. I want to die as a brave man. And bam, it stops right before his neck. Oh, it's act of God. You're free to go. So he goes, Irishman.
Okay.
Same thing. You want to die as a coward, as a brave man? Yes, as a brave man. So he lies down. They count 1, 2, and all.
And all of a sudden we have an interruption.
He has say, wait, hold on. I can see what makes it stick.
Jeez. Okay. Yeah. Talk about bad timing. Gee. I can see what makes it stick.
Yeah. Well, honest man though.
Yeah, well, yeah, true, but wrong time to be honest.
See, in his case, he should have choose to die as a coward. So
right. I don't want to be dead. I don't want to lose my head over this.
Jonathan, now coming back to Ukrainian
Yeah.
situation, this
Oh,
is
yeah.
as we discussed and so on. But you know what? The more I read the new weapons what Ukraine is developing, and the fact is that beside this horrible and brutal attacks, which are terrorist attacks on Ukrainian cities,
Yeah.
Russia is hardly making any progress. It's like before they were slowly getting a little bit ahead. They no longer can move anywhere. They
And
can
guess
only
what?
move.
And yes, and here's where I would assert that the Trump administration is seeing these same things. They're seeing the same evidence. They're seeing the lack of progress that Russia is making, despite all of its braggadocio to the contrary, that they are not making progress. And given the competing problems that the Trump administration is facing, they and I cannot. Again, I'm not an insider, but they have probably privately calculated that Ukraine can successfully, with European help, which they do not control, that with European help and the combination of other factors, that Ukraine will be able to successfully hold off Russia. And if, as I have been asserting, if Ukraine is able to select the proper moment, because now the entire outcome of the Russia-Ukraine war is hinging upon the destruction of one final thing, the Kerch Bridge. It is on the verge of being rendered totally inoperable. It has already been severely damaged. Western analysts and observers have noted both the political significance of Crimea and the military significance of the Kerch Bridge. If the Kerch Bridge is destroyed, completely severed and destroyed, then that removes Russia's one logistical and reinforcement link to the Crimea. That leaves the Russian occupation forces in Crimea isolated. And then Ukraine, with whatever forces it has managed to secretly mobilize or set aside for the purpose of a counteroffensive, and they have shown that they are able to, they have shown lately an ability to exercise a counteroffensive on the eastern portion of Ukraine to counterattack against attempted Russian penetrations. But I would also estimate that given their increasing number of and high quality of technological weapons that at their disposal, that they will be able to launch a Bulge type, an Ardennes type counteroffensive against the Crimea. Once the link has been severed, they can then counterattack the Crimea, force the surrender of the Russian occupiers in Crimea. Crimea then falls back under Ukrainian control, and that will be a visible, decisive, and I believe war-ending defeat for the Russian occupiers, because Russia, their continued ability to wage war, given the economic pressures that are resulting from the sanctions and their growing exhaustion, both economically and militarily, and the fact that once the war ends, whether it's a forced end or a negotiated end, or just Russia declaring victory and going home, the Russians are going to be suffering severe economic consequences as well as demographic consequences for decades to come. And they're going to have more than enough to occupy them. And then the way will be cleared, interestingly enough, for Trump's economically based foreign policy strategy to take effect. To have Ukrainians who are currently living abroad coming back to Ukraine and helping to economically restore Ukraine's ability and its economy, and to integrate Ukraine into the European Union. Despite the severity and the dangers involved in the current situation, there is still the potential, based on those supposedly can't ever happen events. You've seen how many military analysts have been saying there's no way that Ukraine can recover the Crimea from Russia. When you get a whole bunch of people saying that, it's time to be skeptical. It's time to look because Ukraine, you've noticed during this entire war, Ukraine has defied expectations continually. They have exceeded the expectations and predictions of all those observers who are claiming that Russia is inevitably going to win. They have more resources. They have more this. They have more that. And yet, there are also crippling weaknesses that Russia has, which have been consistently overlooked, and most notably, their logistical weakness. And as you've noted, the Russians using what? What are they using now to get supplies for the front? Donkey.
A lot of donkeys
Yeah,
now.
yeah, a lot of donkeys. Yeah, that's basically back to the level of World War II with horse-drawn wagons. And had it not been for those Ford trucks that the U.S. supplied, the Red Army would never have been able to drive Nazi Germany's armies out of Russia. So right now, it's still very much an open game.
Well, in the next few days, there will be a lot of new developments. There will be NATO, European meetings. There were recently, a couple of days ago, in Poland, there was a very interesting international meeting of Eastern European countries discussing ways to support Ukraine. And they came with a joint communique that they fully depend on Ukraine for their security, because while it's uncertain whether the U.S. will continue to adhere to NATO, the Article 5, and how it's going to play and so on, they understand that they, the same as Ukraine, will have to defend themselves. And as long as they are able to help Ukraine withstand Russian attack, the more time they will have to prepare for Russian attack, and maybe even eliminate even the possibility of such an attack if Ukraine will be successful. So more and more people understand the meaning of Ukrainian resistance and the importance of it.
And Poland, let's keep in mind that Poland has no more love for the Russians than the Ukrainians do.
No.
They have ample historical reason and precedent to loathe the Russians.
Well, I visited
what a danger they are.
Just on my last trip to Europe, just a couple of weeks ago. They are preparing fully for war with Russia. They are using the same strategy as Israel to have their reserves being trained, being ready for action, and that's what Poland is doing. My friend's son-in-law, 53 years old, he was asked for 3 weeks training and retraining and so on. So
they're all
getting ready.
They're all following the advice of the ancient Romans, Sasha. If you want peace, prepare for war.
Yeah, it's still in effect, and that's how the world operates, as we know. Jonathan, thank you very much for today's program. Have a great weekend.
Well, you do the same.
Yeah, and see you on Tuesday, same place.
Excellent. It should be exciting.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
God bless America.
Slava Ukraini.